Ladies and gentlemen, we are prepared to open the December 10th hearing of the Historic Preservation Commission. It is 9:03 a.m. We will proceed with introductions beginning on my far right. Turn your microphone on. Thank you.
Dominique Cobb, Urban Planner, Historic Preservation.
Thomas Pluckon, archaeologist, University of South Florida.
Vivian Salaga, Preservation Architect.
Missy Shoecraft, Historic Preservationist.
We have the review of the minutes of the September 17th meeting, and are there any comments or corrections to those minutes? Seeing none, I would ask for approval of those minutes as written.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
And Mr. Fernandez, announcements, please. I must apologize, I always neglect the introduction of the staff. So could you please do that as well?
Sure.
While you're
Joining
doing
me
your announcements.
Sure. Joining us this morning are Elaine Lund, our Historic Preservation Specialist, Beverly Jusak, who's going to be taking the minutes for the record today, and Kate Wells, our Board Attorney.
Thank you.
And good morning. Welcome to our last meeting of our calendar year. You should have received your 2020 commission schedule. If you haven't, please let us know. We'll provide that to you. That is also available online as well. I did have a brief announcement this morning, more of a reminder that the Interstate Historic Preservation Trust Fund, which I'd given a presentation on a few months back. Get a slide on the Elmo. Is this on Elaine, is this on for the PowerPoint? Okay, there we go. You see that on your screens?
No.
Not yet? Okay. Now you can? Okay, great. The Interstate Historic Preservation Trust Fund?
It's not on our screens.
Not yet? Okay.
Not yet. Not yet.
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Got it now? Okay, great. We are accepting applications for both the grant and loan programs. I wanted to take an opportunity just to announce those both to the commission and to the public that may be viewing. As you may recall, the Interstate Historic Preservation Trust Fund is an incentive program that's in place for property owners that reside in the Tampa Heights, West Tampa, and Ybor City National Register Historic District. The grant program is accepting applications till January the 15th of 2020. That is the program that does require that the property be the homestead of the applicant in addition to satisfying income limits, and work on that particular program for that grant can entail historic restoration, the renovation of a building to bring it back to its historic character, as well as electrical, mechanical, plumbing, and structural improvements. Also being offered with a deadline of the February 12th of 2020 is the Interstate Historic Preservation Trust Fund Loan Program, which the loan program does offer a loan to both homesteaded and income producing properties that can be used for a variety of construction related activities such as structural stabilization, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, the renovation to restore historic characteristics of buildings. See one of the projects that was reviewed and was completed under this program. Pretty dramatic improvement, obviously. And this particular program does open up some interior rehabilitation opportunities as well. So anyone interested in learning more about these programs can contact our office at 274-3100 option 3, or visit the city's website, tampagov.net, with the historic preservation link. And we have all the documents and program information available there. Thank you. And with that, I think we are ready for our swearing.
Excuse me, Ms. Fernandez, I have a question again. As in the previous meeting, I asked about social media presence. I do see the application online, but it is not readily available to all the social media networks that are available. I do have people that are interested in it, but it's on the city website. You have to go so many places. Is there any way that these can be posted or available? I know that they have, what is it called? The neighborhood association has access to it, but the general public, without digging so far to find it.
I'll be happy to talk to our folks in our IT department and see what other opportunities there might be to expand our reach on that. I do notify all the neighborhood associations individually so they can help sort of disseminate the information, these dates, and who might be in need for that particular program. But obviously, we want to have as deep of a reach in this as we can. So, yeah, thank you. And I think we're ready for the swearing.
Anyone wanting to testify today, stand up and raise your right hand. You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're providing today is the truth and nothing but the truth.
I do. And I think we're ready to move to our first point of business this morning.
We are. The first item on the list is the designation, a redesignation, or a designation to contributing status for the property at 1404 Nance Avenue in the Hyde Park District.
Okay. Good morning, Commissioners. Elaine Lund, Historic Preservation staff. We have a presentation here for you this morning on the 1404 Nance Avenue. Let me know, please, if that's up on your screens. Yes, okay. As Chair Salaga stated there, this is a property located in the Hyde Park Historic District. We received an application from the owner who had recently rehabilitated the home to change it from its status as non-contributing in the district to contributing. This property was shown as a non-contributing structure on the local historic district map since 1988. It was built about 1921, and you can see its presence there on the 1922 Sanborn map, along with others along its block at the time on Nance. And this is the current aerial of the property. You can see it there and how it's still located in the same site, and many of the buildings that were original to that area are still in place around it today. On the left, we have a picture of the house from around 1921 to 1923. And then on the right, you can see the house as we had it, the photo that we had of it in our staff files from earlier this decade, not too long ago, in fact, 2013 or 2014. You can see that there have been some alterations made to it. These alterations were noted on the Florida Master Site File Form when this property was inventoried as part of the Hyde Park Historic District inventory back in 1983. So the alterations at that time included the addition of the asbestos siding, vinyl soffits and vents, the replacement of the original windows with jalousie windows, and the installation of the metal awnings that you see there over the windows and porch. In 2018, this property received a certificate of appropriateness through the Architectural Review Commission to rehabilitate the home, and that project included the foundation repair, removal of the historically inappropriate asbestos and vinyl products, reinstallation of double-hung wood windows, and the repair and replacement of the wood siding and trim, exposed rafter tails, the gable vents, and the knee braces. So with the restoration work, this house has been returned to its historic appearance, and you can see the historically appropriate details. When the Hyde Park Historic District became a local historic district, the designation report noted that it met certain criteria that were required at that time, and this was under the previous code that the city of Tampa had, so the requirements for district designation were a little different than they are today, but just they're there on your screen. Generally, they had to have the period of significance greater than 50 years, and that the survey was done in 1983, so the 50-year cutoff then was 1933. So the period of significance for the Hyde Park Historic District was 1886, the date of the oldest structure, to 1933. And it met this report noted that it met the two criteria regarding historic district designation. In 1985, previously, the Hyde Park Historic District was listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and with the criteria that we're a little more familiar with working with today, because our requirements for landmarks and historic districts for this board reflect the National Register criteria. So the period of significance is the same, 1886 to 1933, and the National Register report notes that the district was significant under criterion B and criterion C in the areas of architecture, community planning and development, and settlement. So when we consider changing the status of properties within historic districts today, our code directs us to, well, first the application must be complete, so the owner did satisfy the application criteria found in our code. And then we are directed to look at National Register Bulletin 15 to determine whether or not the property contributes to the integrity of the Hyde Park Historic District. This house was built during the period of significance. It embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type of architecture that's represented throughout Hyde Park, the Craftsman Bungalow style, and it maintains its historic relationship to its site and setting. So our recommendation today is that since 1404 Nance Avenue meets the application criteria of Section 27261 and the criteria found in the National Register Bulletin 15 as a historic resource that maintains the character and integrity of the Hyde Park Historic District, that we recommend approval of the request to change the status of the building from non-contributing to contributing, and also to amend the Hyde Park Historic District historic building inventory. And with that, I'm available for any questions you have. Thank you.
Commissioners, are there any questions to them?
I just have a quick question. It's kind of more procedural, just for my own curiosity. So I understand that criterion B applies to the district, but this not necessarily to this property, but this property gets recommended as contributing to under criteria B too?
Well, when we look at the particular property, it's we're looking how it contributes to the district as a whole. So the district criteria
Or B and C?
Yeah, would be B and C.
Okay.
And
does this contribute to under B?
B. Yeah, that was my question.
Yeah,
as
that'd be
well.
I would say this particular property is more in line with the distinctive characteristics of the type of architecture. So
C.
Yeah. I was just curious. Yeah, if that
Certainly.
was no.
And also the community planning and development area, of course.
That's all I have.
Question? No, my only question was concerning the criteria B that was indicated on the staff report.
Of course.
Are there any comments or remarks from the public? And seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. Is there any further discussion? May I have a motion, please, for the redesignation of the contributing status of this property?
So moved. Somebody's got to do it.
Oh, I didn't make the motion. I just was,
Oh.
oh, you did. You just said yes?
I just said so moved. I thought you had
Wait.
made the motion. I was sorry.
No, I don't make motions
Okay,
typically.
move to accept the staff's recommendation to change the status to contributing for 1404 Nance Avenue. Is that
Because,
under, for its contribution under, to the character and integrity of the Hyde Park Historic District.
specifically categories C and D.
B and C.
No, not B, it's not persons, it's
It's not D,
No, not D.
just
No.
C, I guess we're saying.
C and or D because of its contributions to the development and settlement and planning of Hyde Park historically.
That, I believe, would fall more under category A. Category D is the one that's usually reserved for archaeological sites.
Okay.
the-
All right.
Yeah, since it refers to information in prehistory or history.
Do we-
And additionally, we also need the, a motion to add the property to the historic building inventory for the district.
Kate, do we need to restate that
Yes, we
motion,
do.
do you think?
Given Elaine's suggestion or request to add it to the inventory, I would ask that you restate the motion and include that expressly.
Okay, let me try this again.
Thank you.
I move to change the contributing status of 1404 Nance Avenue such that it is designated under criterion C for its contribution to the character and integrity of the Hyde Park Historic District, and that it be added to the inventory of historic structures in that district.
Is there a second? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Passes unanimously. Thank you, Elaine, for that very thorough report. And we are moving now down the agenda to an update on the Cigar Factory inventory of Tampa.
Good morning, Dennis Fernandez, Architecture Review and Historic Preservation Manager. I'm going to be passing out a list of the remaining Cigar Factory buildings in the city for you to reference. It gets a little bit overwhelming with all the names and dates and places, so I just wanted to have something for you to follow along with. Just on the previous item, I wanted to take a moment to thank Mr. Weathers in reaching out to the staff to redesignate the property. A little bit of background on the property. The home was his childhood home. It was owned by his parents for many years, and then he moved into it to make it his home, and went through very extensive rehabilitation to bring it back to the character that he remembers when he was growing up. Couldn't be here this morning, but did want to thank him. It's not typical that we're able to add a contributing structure within the period of historic significance back into the inventory and protect it. So all the new construction that's built after the period of historic significance is non-contributing. So you know, I think a very nice thing to end the year on, to be able to do that. Moving into this item, I wanted to place this on the agenda at the request of City Council. You may recall earlier this year there was a lot of discussion on the cigar factories, particularly those in West Tampa that lacked local designation. And there was a discussion at City Council and then a request that be brought back to this commission for further discussion. So I'm going to give a PowerPoint presentation to somewhat familiarize you with the inventory and the dynamics of the different buildings and designations that are out there, and then open up the floor for discussion. I think we're all familiar with the rich and vibrant history of Tampa and its link to cigar manufacturing in the late 19th and early 20th century. These buildings that remain were once the economic engine that fueled not only the growth of the city, but also the cultural development of the city as immigrants flocked to the area for well-paying jobs and the opportunity to own a home. On September 5th, staff appeared before City Council and provided a similar overview of the remaining cigar factory buildings in the city. And following that discussion, City Council referred the 12 remaining unprotected factories back to the Historic Preservation Commission for further review and discussion. So at the cigar industry's peak in Tampa, there were over 200 factories that were producing over 700 million cigars a year. Of the 200 factories, there were various sizes and designs. They weren't all in the same vernacular that we consider cigar factories today. Some were wood frame, some were constructed of brick, some were smaller in scale, and others shared uses with other retail and manufacturing businesses in the same building under the same roof. Most of the factories were located in Ybor City, and a significant number were also located in West Tampa, but others did exist in surrounding areas. The vast majority of factories were lost to fires and urban renewal programs, interstate highway construction, or just through neglect and demolition. See some examples of some of the lost factories. There's a number of them, but there are factories that survive today that still are in use and are very sound structures that were built for very durable purposes. Of the 200 factories today, 23 generally survive. 9 are located in the Ybor City Historic District, so those enjoy both national and local protection. There are 2 in West Tampa that are designated as local historic landmarks. Of course, you're familiar with the map of Ybor City, the Ybor City Historic District. The red boundary line indicating the boundaries of the local historic district, and the green boundary line indicating the boundaries of the National Historic Landmark District. Here are examples of some of the factories that are located within the Ybor City Historic District. These factories generally have been rehabilitated and been put into alternative uses. Some still function in cigar manufacturing businesses. Some have been adaptively reused into office buildings or other types of industry. It's probably the most dramatic one that we have seen recently, the Oliva Tobacco Company building. It's also the home of Swan Cigars. This is one of the 2 remaining cigar factories in the city that's constructed of lumber, and this has been adaptively reused as apartments currently, just opened last year. The Berryman Morgan Factory on Howard Avenue is a local historic landmark. This, until recently, was being used as a college facility. It's, I think, currently for sale. And the Baldwin Brothers Cigar Factory, which is just a little bit south of the Prior, is also a local landmark, and this is going through a PD rezoning right now for conversion into a hotel. So I'm going to go through the 12 remaining factories and their locations. So there is one factory in Gary, in the previous town of Gary, which is east of Ybor City and north of 7th Avenue. This is the Tierra del Largo factory, constructed in 1908. This is currently vacant. There are plans to adaptively reuse it. We've been in conversations with the owner in recent months. There's one factory this in Ybor City outside of the local historic district, but within the National Historic Landmark District. That's the Perfecto Garcia building. This was probably one of the buildings that I felt had the highest level of threat until recently. It was purchased by new owners, and they are in the process of adaptively converting it, I believe, to office use. It's gone through dramatic changes in the last few months. Most recently, the water tower, which still remains one of the few water towers that are in place, was repaired and is now primed. So if you went by the building, you'd see it currently under construction. There are two remaining factories in Palmetto Beach, which is the area south of Adamo Drive, just south of Ybor City. The Salvador Rodriguez, this is the second remaining factory that's constructed out of lumber that I had mentioned earlier. Constructed in 1898, and you see it's currently clad, I believe, in some type of synthetic siding like vinyl or aluminum. And the La Karina factory, constructed in 1895 on 22nd Street. These factories are in very close proximity to each other. And I believe this is currently used for office uses, office suites. And then these are the 8 factories that are within West Tampa. 7 of them are within the West Tampa National Register Historic District. The Pendas and Alvarez factory with its decorative water tower that's a clock on the exterior, making it very unique. It's constructed in 1909, and you may recall there was just a newspaper article that this factory's for sale. I've been actually contacted this week by a couple of different prospective buyers to discuss incentives. The Morgan factory, which is north on Howard, constructed in 1907. This building's been, for quite some time, been utilized for office use and is, I believe, currently occupied in that purpose. The San Martin and Leon factory, also currently being used for office use, constructed in 1902. The Bastille Brothers and Diaz factory on North Albany Avenue, constructed in 1903. This factory also was recently for sale, I believe. I'm not sure of the status currently, but I know it was being advertised. The Samuel I. Davis factory, which is located on the corner of Howard Avenue and Cypress Street, constructed in 1910, is currently vacant. The Centace company, constructed in 1906, 1904. This is the factory that was in the newspaper because the property owner had begun to paint it. You see the never was completed, but you see the beginning of the painting there on the right of the upper picture. And as I understand it, this building is also for sale currently. The Villazone and Garcia and Vega factory, constructed in 1907. This is still being used by the Oliva Tobacco Company for their office use. It's been well maintained. Andres and Diaz, the Andres Diaz factory, constructed in 1908. I believe it's currently being used by the county. The school system, I believe, is in this building. So under the historic designation criteria, typically how these buildings have been determined to be of historic significance is under criterion A for their role in the community planning and development of these independent cities that we've seen that, you know, at some point became incorporated into the city of Tampa. Their planning component not only to the economic development, but also to the residential planning characteristics that were employed when in their vicinity. You see, these are very typical Sanborn pages that illustrate the building patterns around cigar factories. Typically, you would have the cigar factory, which is indicated here sort of in the center. The red rectangles, those are indicating brick construction, the red color. The yellow color on the Sanborn indicates construction of lumber. Then within close proximity, you see just to the north of the Cuesta Rey factory, usually some type of retail or mercantile business was in place that kind of supplied goods to the property owners in the vicinity. And then the cigar factory developers would construct homes and offer those homes to be able to be either rented or sold often to the workers. So that was also in the vicinity of the factory. And this relationship between the industrial, the mercantile, and the residential is a very unique system within the factory town model that we see throughout our city. Here's some photos, you know, further reinforcing that. Then, you know, another area that's very unique, and one reason why Ybor City was designated as a National Historic Landmark District was the fact that the cultural clubs were put in place also within these areas that supported the immigrant population, both financially, with educational opportunities, and with programs that helped them to assimilate into the American culture as well. And that speaks to category as ethnic heritage and social history. And obviously that resonates through our community today. We see that in a lot of the festivals and art illustrations throughout the city as well. And then the building's architecture is unique and was identified as a qualifying criteria within their local and national register designations. Although these are somewhat say characteristic of a factory in any town, these buildings were built in a way that they maximized the ventilation and the exposure to sun by having east-west orientation for the front of the building or the back of the building, and a north-south orientation for the longer sides of the building. So you'll see that dynamic in every cigar factory that we covered today. You see some of the architectural attributes. Although large and utilitarian buildings, they still exhibit a high degree of architectural detail that somewhat becomes, I think, symbolic of their importance in our community. So as we go into discussion today, I believe, you know, something to keep in mind that, we, I think, tried to cover is that most of the cigar factories that we have in the city are in use in some way. They may be underutilized, but there's only, I believe, 2 that are vacant. We have often, the staff is often contacted when cigar factories are on the market, being sold, to inquire about what incentives are in place and what requirements there are for the remaining factories. We've seen a resurgence in investment into West Tampa recently, and that's helping to fuel some of the interest in the redevelopment of these buildings. So with that in mind, I think a prudent first step would be to reach out to the building owners of these buildings, create an opportunity for a dialogue and to educate them on the incentives that are in place, the benefits, some of the consideration that they get with the Florida Building Code in the redevelopment and within the zoning code for the redevelopment of the building that benefits them towards adaptive reuse. And, to bring that up at a future public hearing before this commission and give you an update and then help you to determine options for next steps. So with that, I'll open the floor for discussion. Happy to answer any questions that I can.
Dennis, where is the Tierra del Lago factory? It's in the middle of 1908 North 36th Street,
That's in,
not in a district
it's in
anywhere.
Gary, in the
that's the one
former
in
city of Gary.
Okay.
And Gary's not, we've talked to some property owners in that area about perhaps creating a multiple properties designation, but there's not a, enormous amount of fabric left in that area. We've driven it a number of times over the years. They participate in the East Tampa, the East Ybor City Neighborhood Association, so they've somewhat joined with them. But the I-4 crosstown connector somewhat, has bifurcated that area and kind of, it is a little bit separate from Ybor at this time, physically anyway.
It seems, as you suggested, that the most pressing need is in West Tampa. Do you have a feel for how feasible a local historic district there? Because my daughter goes to McFarland Park too, and I'm seeing a lot of infilling on the of this factory housing too.
Yeah.
So it seems like we're losing a lot there.
Yeah, I recently attended somewhat of a group neighborhood association meeting with some of the associations in the West Tampa area, and they expressed some interest in local designation. The original inventory was done in the late 80s for West Tampa, so there's a need to update that. I've already begun to somewhat identify grant sources because we would need to enlist a cultural resource company to go out there, and it's a pretty extensive inventory that would need to happen. But that would be another approach if designation were sought, would be to try to create a local district that would include cigar factories, obviously, as an important component of that district.
I have a follow-up question, Dennis, which is, in the past, you've made mention of use of grants. In your budget, does the city actually allocate funds for hiring consultants to do this work for you, or does it always have to be done through a grant?
Well, through the budgetary process, if I know that there's something coming up, I can put in for that within my budget. But our normal budget doesn't include that type of funding. We usually will identify a matching source in some way, and then go through the state Division of Historical Resources grant process. They have a source there for funding these types of surveys. Now, the Interstate Historic Preservation Trust Fund has developed to a point where that could be used as a match, and that may be the source that I request be utilized for that purpose. The last inventory that we did was in South Ybor City in the industrial area, south of 6th Avenue between generally Nucio Parkway and 22nd or 27th Street, and with Adamo as a southern boundary. That, I believe, was $15,000, but we were funded in whole for that amount through the state, through the grant process.
Okay. And then I have a question for the attorney, and I'm sorry, I really should know this. Does the local designation require owner consent, or can it be done without it?
Owner consent is one of the factors that's taken into consideration, but it's not a requirement.
It's not a requirement?
I think when I met with Dennis in preparation for today's meeting, the administration's goal is for this to be voluntary and to approach the property owners with regard to the incentives and what's available if you do have this status as a landmark, rather than mandating it without their agreement.
Thank you.
But a local district requires 50% of the owners, right?
There's not actually a percentage of that consent to it. That's been something that staff hasn't really supported. We would rather rely on the validity of the designation, and if the area was deserving, then city council would be the determining factor of moving that along. One thing to mention as well is that the commission about 12 years ago, this commission had gone through a pretty extensive exercise of trying to move these remaining factories forward without owner consent, and it really was kind of embroiled in a process for a number of months, and unfortunately just was sort of remanded back to the Historic Preservation Commission. That's when we were able to locally designate the two West Tampa factories. So sometimes going back out voluntarily when the opportunities are there, because aside from the gentleman who decided to paint the building, most of the factories are very good candidates for the local and the national or the federal tax incentives. And it's it's very compelling group of incentives that encourage property owners in the redevelopment process to actually locally designate so that they can realize those incentives. Larger scale projects, like more recently the Le Meridian downtown, the hotel, the Armature Works building, these scale of projects tend to realize the greatest advantage in the incentive process, and so the square footage and scale of these projects normally does compel sophisticated developers to consider them into their business plan.
I do have a question or statement. For these that are not protected, is there any way, I know there are incentives and benefits that are available, but instead of waiting for the seller to contact, is there any way that we can push that out so that they can be a little bit more apt to say, well, I'm looking at this building, these are the benefits up front, versus them contacting the historic preservation for those grants or benefits?
Well, most of the benefits that are out there, some developers who contact us have dealt with historic properties before, and so they're, basically contacting us to get more program-related information. They're already familiar with the incentives that are out there. We have these available on our website. We try to promote these, obviously, when I go out to communities to talk. I'm always encouraging redevelopment and encouraging individuals to take advantage of the funding opportunities that are out there, because they're tailored for these type of projects. But if there's any any interest in a building, normally the realtors are also somewhat in tune with the incentives. It's obviously a carrot for the sale of the property. So there's usually some depth of knowledge by the time they contact us, and we're sort of filling in the holes.
Okay, I noticed over the last 2 months, there have been a big push in West Tampa, revitalization. One thing I did not see is the city's presence was there, but around those buildings, there was no, I guess, information. There were shops that were there, but there were no information on the history of those buildings. So maybe when the city is doing those type of programs, maybe historic preservation can maybe send some information to, because I know I was excited about seeing the little things I've never seen before, but having some information on the history of those buildings so that others in the community can be aware of what's going on and how it plays a part in Tampa's history.
Definitely, yeah. Well, I often work with the Community Development Corporation in West Tampa and rely upon them for, what opportunities there are. But we'll definitely coordinate with them on any events. And I know just recently we've had sort of a higher level of coordination interdepartmentally that would facilitate that as well.
Now, as Dennis, as I understood it from your presentation, it's your intention now to reach out to the owners of these factories to revisit the possibility of designation?
I think, to do a concerted effort, this is sort of happening reactively. I think to put together, a packet of information that's tailored for this, send it out to the cigar factory owners and having the building owners, and have, try to initiate a discussion and obviously go through the steps to kind of follow up, to meet with them and have that dialogue and explain to them what's out there and what the not only what the incentives are, but what the responsibilities are of historic designation. I think that's the first place where we'd want to normally start in any discussion on designation. It's no different than we would if we were going to be trying to move a designation for the entire area. We would, of course, reach out to property owners in that way. It's just a little bit more tailored approach, I believe.
Would it be actually easier to create the district as opposed to a more comprehensive district as opposed to like these individual landmarkings?
I think they can. I don't know about easier. I think it's a more protracted process for a historic district because it involves more property owners. Much more of a deliberate process for public engagement, where you're having meetings and going to the neighborhoods, and so this is probably a little bit as time-wise a little bit more expeditious. But if a district discussion started to develop, I don't think that the information would change much for the factory owners, and I don't think it would be sort of wasted time.
But an owner doesn't actually have to agree to allow their property to be a contributing structure in a district, do they?
Not under our current code, no. The city council would ultimately make that determination about boundaries and the composure of the district. I mean, we would certainly, in the case of the factories, the buildings that we reviewed this morning, those would generally qualify to be a contributing structure. They still exhibit their character. That's the one point where when you begin to paint factories or to modify them, that you do have some exposure there to really somewhat adversely impacting the historic character of the building, where it could potentially not be contributing. I don't personally believe paint rises to that level because paint is removable, But if a redevelopment down the road wanted to do something like stucco a building or, you know, begin to really change the character of the building, that could eliminate that from being a contributing structure.
Since these 8 cigar factories are already included in the National Register District, would not the inventory and the information from the survey taken to create the National District be available to you so that it would facilitate creating a local district within that same boundary?
Well, these particular buildings are well documented, both, you know, through the National Register designation, and we've kept up, you know, the information so it's current. I think what would take more time would be the surrounding properties of what is composing the neighborhood, determining the original boundaries of the National Register District, what remains, what's been altered that could be potentially non-contributing or even contributing. There's been some very positive restorative work in West Tampa also that could have changed designation classifications. And then I think, you know, reevaluating the boundaries, I think, would probably be necessary to determine what would be a viable boundary today. Presuming that the cigar factories are within that boundary, then they would be part of the larger group. But there could be a situation where our consultant doesn't include maybe a factory on the north end or on the south end. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we'd still be seeking to protect that factory.
You know, it sounds like you might already have this in your head, and perhaps you don't have it on paper too, but it'd be nice to see like sort of an action plan for each one or group of related ones. Because it seems like Perfecto Garcia just requires a change in the local historic district probably, which seemed pretty minor from the map.
Right.
It might be pretty easy to do a local historic district for the 2 in Palmetto because they're right next to each other, right? So if we could, you know, I'd prefer to see a district for the West Tampa one so it gets some of the fabric of the neighborhood included too, but, you know, it would just be nice to see sort of, and I guess some of those are staff, potentially could be done by staff and some are going to require grant money or.
Well, right, and I mean, all the action items would come back to this board, so regardless of whether we go the landmark route or the district or both, you know, it would be a recommendation that would be coming from the Historic Preservation Commission to City Council for that local ordinance to be adopted. Now, what we could do is begin this discussion and have maybe within the first quarter come back to you, let you know how it's going, and if you feel that staff should kind of continue down the engagement with the cigar factory owners or somewhat pivot more towards the local district. And then we would obviously want to have some of the community involved in that particular meeting, so it gives an opportunity to notify at least the neighborhood associations that are within the area to come and participate.
Is there any recommendation you need for this commission to make in order to move your work forward?
I mean, I don't believe that this requires a motion, but I would, you know, if you feel that this is the path that we should be going down to, just sort of a consensus, you know, to begin that process of engagement and then report back to you, say in March would be, I think, give us enough time to have some more data for you.
Okay. I think given the comments, I think there is a consensus that this is a worthy effort and should be pursued.
Okay. Thank you. We'll
And
be
so
coming back to you in March or sooner.
Yeah, okay. And then the next item then on our agenda is the update on the local historic guidelines, Ybor City.
Once again, updating you on this, it'll be a brief update. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to engage a firm yet. We are going through the process with our contract management division, contract administration division, and we have currently awaiting a response from one of the firms. They have until the end of this week to let us know. So we have a process that we have to go through of offering the proposal and waiting for a response. We're still sort of engaged in that. The first firm that we reached out to, unfortunately, didn't have the resources to take on this particular project. So we're hopeful that the remaining firms on the list will. If we do not receive a response through our somewhat pre-qualified list, then we'll most likely have to issue a full request for proposal and accept bids from outside the current system. So I'll continue to keep you updated, but it was something I had hoped that I would have beginning at least at the end of this year. So I didn't make that goal, but hopefully at the beginning of next year we can get the firm on and get going. I know that the Ybor City community is excited about the opportunity to update those guidelines.
And now our next date and time of meeting, at least is scheduled for January 14th, 2020, in this room at 9 a.m.
That's correct.
And we'll look forward to seeing you all. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season and a happy new year. And we
Thank you.
look forward to lots of work, positive work that we can help you all do.
Thank you very much for your commitment to historic preservation, and I look forward to working with you in the new year.
Yeah. For those who are listening, in the broadcast of this meeting, we are still looking for additional members for the commission seats, so we would encourage anyone with an interest to please step forward and contact Dennis Fernandez. And on that note, it is 10 a.m. and we are adjourned.
Honestly, open seat is just a general seat.